Welcome, everyone, and good evening. I'm Tom Putnam, and on behalf of the Atlantic Hall Board of Directors, I want to thank you all so much for coming. We are so pleased by this robust turnout, and I am especially happy and relieved that we did not have to turn anyone away at the door. This would be a good time to silence your cell phones and acquaint yourselves with the two emergency fire exits, the stairs you came up, and there's a fire escape in the back of the hall. We are, as many of you know, a former firehouse, after all. We gather, of course, as part of our nation's celebration of the 250th anniversary of our founding. But let me begin by noting that the history of this building goes back to almost the midpoint of our national story. It was exactly 120 years ago, in April of 1906, that Cape Porpoise assembled its first firefighting organization, the Atlantic Hose Company, and with the equipment they purchased being stored in barns throughout the town. A decade later, with monies raised locally by the women of this community, a theme we'll hear more about later this evening, a Chevrolet hose truck was purchased, and a decision was made to build a fire hall in the center of our village. The foundation was poured in 1914. The advent of World War I put the plans on hold until 1919, but then an architectural firm from Boston was hired to design the new building, including an engine room, a dining room, a kitchen, and a small library on the first floor. And the second floor was to be a hall that would be a meeting place for residents to gather. After the Great Fire of 1947, Kennebunkport decided to build a number of new firehouses, including one just across the street that continues to this day. And now, as many of you know, Atlantic Hall is a community-owned event site and is maintained through rentals and fundraising, including pancake breakfasts, book sales, craft fairs, and events like this one. There is a donation table in the back, and we welcome your generous support, cash, checks, and we even have our trustee square available with Lucille in the corner if you would like to use your credit card. And of course, we still house this village's lending library. In fact, our librarian who's here tonight, Marion Donovan, has assembled a table in the back featuring books from our collection related to local history. And often, out-of-town visitors searching for reliable 24/7 Wi-Fi service can be seen parked in our small lot at all hours of the day, hunched over their laptops and cell phones. The mantra that our first speaker, Tom Bradbury, uses in his role as executive director of the Kennebunkport Conservation Trust is, quote, "Together we can do great things." One of the many secrets of the Trust's success over the years is Tom's audaciousness, which can be seen in the efforts that he and others led 50 years ago to reenact the Revolutionary War Battle of Cape Porpoise Harbor. Please join me in welcoming Tom to tell the tale of that historic reenactment.
Thank you, Tom. That's not what he told me before. What he told me before was he was at the last talk that I gave, which was at the Trust, and I was asked to speak for 20 minutes, and in an hour they pulled me off stage. And so what Tom told me for this one is he didn't care what I said, but keep it to 10 minutes sharp, you know. And also my goal is to not set too high a standard for the others who will speak. So if anything goes wrong, just assume that it's planned that way so that everyone else will look better. But anyway, when I was much younger, back in 1976, the town asked me if I would be a co-chair of the Kennebunkport Bicentennial Committee. And I said yes, I thought that would be a good idea. And I think it was my first thing I ever did for the town, like a formal committee. And then, having become a committee member, I thought it would be a good idea that we should reenact the Battle of Cape Porpoise. And being young and audacious, I didn't kind of realize all the steps that went into that, but figured that we could just work them all out, which we sort of did. We got put together a committee and called on a lot of people to assist. We called the York militias in New Hampshire. We needed 2 horses. We needed 2 cannons. We needed a ship, and and we needed people that could swim, and we needed a rescue team if anything went wrong. But we thought, well, actually we did. We pulled it all together, and we're feeling quite good when we came to the day that the event was supposed to take place. And then in the morning, I woke up, and a thick fog was over the harbor. And you actually couldn't, if you were standing on Cape Porpoise Pier, you would not be able to see the boats and their moorings right across the harbor. So we were scheduled to meet that day downstairs in this building, as every event in Cape Porpoise for the last 100 years has been scheduled to take place, right here. And so when I got to came into the meeting with a few others of us, there was a reporter there, and she just said, well, I assume you're canceling all this. And I said, I don't think so. I've got all these people coming from everywhere, and I don't know how to contact them to say it's not going on. She said, well, you can't go out and look at it and that sort of thing. And said, no, I get that, but we can't cancel. And we sat down, and we had originally planned for having the soldiers that were going to be fighting and the sailors that were coming off of the ship go on to Bass Island and fight it out there. We decided to pull that to Pinkham Island because it was closer to the pier and we could see things better, and perhaps even with some fog, that would work out. And Frank Hanlon was we were going to use his ship in the battle. And about the time we were deciding to move the reenactment closer to shore, Frank called and said, well, actually the fog is so thick that I can't get out of the river. And I said, if I sent somebody over to lead you, could you do it that way? And he said, I'd try. And so I called up George Lush, who lived around the corner here, who had radar. And I said, George, would you mind going out and going over to the port and leading this ship back into the channel? And fortunately, he said yes and headed in that direction. So about this time, I would like to tell you why we wanted to reenact the Battle of Cape Porpoise, because it's so often overlooked or taken for granted by all of us, I think. And I found a piece of information, as I always do, written or discovered by Sharon Cummins, who is sitting right here, who does such magnificent work for the Kennebunkport Historical Society. And she came up with a transcription of the battle that was in the New England Chronicle in October 3rd, 1782. And so this is the actual newspaper article about that battle. And I'm just going to read excerpts of it in the interest of time. You're welcome, Tom. And please forgive me because this font is like a 9 and my eye recovery is like a 20. So I'll do the best I can. But on the 8th instant, early in the morning, the enemy from the eastward appeared at Cape Porpoise Harbor in a large brig of 16 guns and a topsail schooner of about 12 guns. Their design seems to have been to take out a large sloop loaded with lumber with a schooner then in Cape Porpoise Harbor, and also to plunder the cattle and sheep on the nearest island. Accordingly, the brig sent in her boat with about 36 to 38 men to take out the said vessel. An alarm was immediately made in the town, and the militia collected as soon as possible on a large island near to but separated from the said Goat Island by a narrow channel known by the name of Trot's Island, with 2 pieces of cannon, within fair musket shot of the enemy, and began to fire upon them therewith. Many shots were exchanged. The militia then thought proper to move on to Goat Island, where the enemy had landed, and accordingly forded the channel, some of them up to their middle and others up to their arms, exposed to the whole force of the enemy's fire, which was furiously hurled in volleys of manifold death on their center and rear. From the schooner, traveling without the mouth of the harbor, which when the enemy on the island perceived what was happening, they precipitously went to their boats. The militia arrived just as the enemy were pulling off from shore, and poured their fire upon them with a brisk and lavish hand, while the whole force of the enemy's artillery was leveled at them, and the cannon ball, grape shot, and musketry flew thick around them, and like showers of hail, which they heroically sustained and continued on with their fire, unremitting vigor and activity on the enemy for 5 or 6 hours. By several of our people who were near enough to make observations, we learned that there were 14 killed in the boat and 20 wounded, 6 of them whom died of their wounds soon as they were carried aboard the schooner. And but 3 of the whole crew, this is the British now, that went over the gunwale earlier of the brig, only 3 were unhurt. Besides that, 4 or 5 were killed in the boat, carrying up the anchor to try to warp the brig out of the harbor. The gracious care of the divine providence through the whole day was really very remarkable and ought to be gratefully acknowledged in covering the heads and preserving the lives and limbs of many of our people, so long and so greatly exposed to the numerous and manifold snares of death, which flew so thick in quick succession around them. But one man was hurt. Captain James Burnham, about 46 years of age, was killed in the close of the engagement with a musket ball through his breast, which brought about instant death. And then the article concludes, the militia did honor to themselves while they conducted with that prudent, steady, unshaken courage and resolution which demonstrated them worthy of the free and peaceful enjoyments of their invaluable rights and privileges which Britain has ferociously endeavored to wrest from this injured country. Now, what we fail to think about sometimes is that was written 6 years after the Declaration of Independence. The nation had been fighting, and the people of this town had been engaged in battles and deprivations for 6 long years. And so that's what we were honoring when we put together the battle. And as fate would have it, it wasn't like right around 9 o'clock that the fog lifted. It didn't gradually kind of ease away or will itself slowly. I mean, we looked out the window and it was gone, And I've been lucky enough to have that happen and a number of events since then, for which I am very grateful. But earlier, I had asked the church on the Cape if the members of the congregation would consider all dressing as in revolutionary costume for this special day that we were having. And this is the Reverend Lamar Robinson and his family who conducted the services there. And this is the Seavey family that was there for the day, and virtually all of the congregation were dressed in just the same way. A number of people came to witness the event and started to crowd the town square. The church bells were rung loud and in succession, and the militia, mostly York militia and different members of the various New Hampshire groups had arrived on the scene. And so they were assembled on the green next to the church on the Cape, and Speech was given to them by the leader of the group, and then Reverend Robinson gave a prayer. And then off they marched down to the pier road to engage the enemy. In the meantime, you had to let people of the town know about it. So we had riders that went out down the pier road, down the Langsford Road, and around the various things of the town to spread the alarm that the British were coming. And on the pier, they manned the cannons that we had facing the harbor, ready to go off. We had one at the pier and one at the end of the Langsford Road. Now, in the original battle, while all of this was happening, while the militia were gathering and trying to get out to Trot's Island, as was said earlier, there was a man named Samuel Wiles who lived in town, and his brother had died aboard a British ship, essentially as a prisoner, and his son was a prisoner of the British at the time, and he was not fond of them coming into Cape Porpoise Harbor, and he rowed out to tell them to get out, which wasn't the wisest course of action. So he railed at them for some time, they mocked him and so on, and then eventually shot him, and he went over. In the reenactment, that happened. He got up, went over, and then we had we got the swim instructor of a pool in Kennebunk to be out there to dive off of the boat and go in, rescue him, pull him in, and then these group pulled him into their boat and brought him back to the shore to safety. As soon as he was out of the way, the cannons started firing from both sides, loud and nice, and all of the militia got in boats and were taken across to the island. The British, Frank Hanlon's ship had come into the harbor. We had Sea Scouts on there dressed in, as best we could do, sailor uniforms. They got out, landed on the other side of the island. They engaged with one another and fought it out for some time until finally the British retreated and left the harbor. That's right. And what you did is what the audience did at the pier. They cheered loudly and congratulated a well-fought victory. And the members of the militia congratulated one another. And then everyone marched back to the square, back to this hall, in fact, and dispersed after just a great event. But something to keep an eye on is at the pier on the ledge overlooking the harbor is a monument to that battle. And we all look at it and we all kind of take it for granted because it's always been there. But what we shouldn't take for granted is the courage of the men who fought that day before. It was something really remarkable. Thank you so much.
Tom is a treasure for this community. We thank you. I should note here that in addition to other celebrations, the Conservation Trust, the Graves Library, and the Kennebunkport Historical Society and the town's Parks and Recreation Department are sponsoring a dessert potluck on the Village Green on Sunday, July 5th from noon to 2. And you are all invited to come and bring your potluck, bring your own lunch, and then there'll be a potluck reception. It's a community celebration in honor of the 250th. Another of the great historic treasures of this community is the Brick Store Museum in Kennebunk. The tagline the museum uses following its logo reads, quote, "Igniting personal connections to local history, art, and culture since 1936. Currently, the spark plug at the center of that ignition and who masterfully keeps those connections flowing is our next speaker, Cynthia Walker, the museum's executive director.
Okay, I don't know if I like going after Tom Bradbury, but that's okay. Growing up, many of my weekends were spent sitting on the couch with my parents, watching old war movies on AMC. This is kind of a placeholder picture, but my grandfather is in the little red circle there just as a placeholder. Because of our family history, like many of you, we were very drawn to specific stories. And since both of my grandfathers served in World War II, naturally this meant Band of Brothers, Great Escape, Saving Private Ryan were on an annual rotation in our house. My mother's family, as an aside, were also Italian immigrants, so that also meant to balance out the Allied forces, we watched Godfather at least twice a year, which my dad swore was exactly like my mother's family. I don't know about that, but... as a kid, I was completely engrossed, marinating in this intense cocktail of Italian-American culture and World War II history. I loved it, which is why I went into the field that I did. But as I grew older and became a historian, something dawned on me. Every one of our foundational cultural stories was told through a heavy, unmistakably male lens. It goes without saying that women were legally and socially barred from those roles. There's a reason it's called Band of Brothers. It celebrates a deep-seated, incredibly vital, shared experience born of collective struggle. Men had the battlefield, the legislative floor, even the high seas to forge these unbreakable historic bonds. Selfishly, as a young female loving history, I wanted to be part of a grand tradition like that. But where was the Band of Sisters? On the surface of history, it didn't seem to exist. For centuries, women were siloed inside the home, tethered to domestic duties, and isolated from one another. There was no institutional machine forcing them into a collective trenches-style sisterhood. Women's collective legacy did not build the way that men's did. This is why, for time immemorial now, the great struggle of history has been how to ensure everyone's story is told. But who is actually keeping the record? This brings us to one of the most ironic plot twists of American history, in my opinion. Women were quietly powering the saving of that history. Women were the foundational architects of the historic preservation movement in the United States, operating as early advocates, researchers, and fundraisers decades before they secured the right to vote. Let me tell you how. The art of memory keeping is a deliberate, sophisticated strategy to ensure that people, cultures, and truths survive the silencing of time. Historic preservation is a tool of public belonging, allowing people who were not originally included in the narrative to finally be included. Why are we able to celebrate 250 years of the United States? There are, of course, many, many answers to that question, but we can all collectively remember our past today, despite being over 2 centuries removed, because of the historic preservation work done by many people before us. Someone actively decided to save that information. And in America, that movement started at Mount Vernon, George Washington's home. After decades of being privately owned by the Washington family, the estate fell into horrific disrepair. You can see in this photo, there's beams holding up the roof. Roofs were leaking, porches were collapsing. The home of the hero of the Revolution was about to disappear forever. John Washington III, who owned it at the time of the 1850s, approached the US Congress and said, and I'm paraphrasing, "You need to buy this for the American people." And Congress, in classic fashion perhaps, essentially said, "No thanks, we're good." To be fair, it was 1853. Congress was panicking because the country was violently fracturing and on the precipice of war. They didn't have the money or the bandwidth. So John went to the state of Virginia. He asked Virginia. They also said no. Enter Anne Pamela Cunningham. She looked at the crumbling home of the nation's founder and wrote a rallying cry to the nation. Her first sentence of her letter read, "If the men of America have seen fit to allow the home of its most respected hero go to ruin, Why can't the women of America band together to save it? Anne rallied women across the country. She raised what equates to $6 million in today's money, securing donations from women in almost every single state at the time. They bought it, they saved Mount Vernon, and they created America's very first historic house museum, setting off a spark that inspired hundreds of thousands of historical societies and house museums across the nation. Other examples include in 1894, a woman named Kate Hall at the Whitechapel Museum transformed simple gallery spaces into vibrant community centers. Isabella Stewart Gardner opened her museum in 1903 to share global beauty with the public. In 1929, 3 women, Abby Rockefeller, Lily Bliss, and Mary Sullivan, defied the male-dominated art establishment to found the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. And even America's favorite pastime found a home this way. While baseball was a game played and popularized by men, the National Baseball Hall of Fame, while not founded by a woman, was funded by the Clark family, the very creators of the Singer sewing machine, an invention that revolutionized women's work and granted them the time to engage in civic life. So it was thousands of local citizens, many of them women before women truly entered the workforce, who realized that intimate stories of our small towns were slipping through our fingers. All of this brings me right back to where we aren't standing there, but we are standing on July 1st, a couple miles away. The Brickstore Museum on Main Street in Kennebunk was founded 90 years ago today, on July 1st, 1936. Our founder, named Edith Barry, was a fiercely unique woman. Born in Boston in 1884, she was the granddaughter of Kennebunk shipbuilders. She grew up outside New York City, but spent summers right here. And she never married, which is an interesting fact about her. Instead, she served as a lieutenant and sharpshooter in the Women's Reserve Corps in World War I, traveled the world as an independent artist well into her 80s. And when she hosted guests in Paris, this is my favorite part about her, she liked to take them to La Folie Bergère and see what their reaction was. She also traveled through the eastern seaboard following the Ringling Brothers Circus for a year in 1932. This is a self-portrait of Edith, by the way. In 1932, she inherited the 1825 brick store at the top of Main Street. As an artist, she had a knack for observation and perspective. So she looked around and recognized a massive cultural deficit. Maine had almost no museums at the time. Nationally, just to give some context, the National Archives opened in 1935. Henry Ford Museum opened in 1933, and the Guggenheim was in 1937. Local historical societies practically did not exist, at least in York County. Most wouldn't open until the 1950s. So Edith opened a small art and history museum in the old brick general store. She invested about $1,200 of her own money, small fortune during the Great Depression, to open it and staffed it by herself for that first year. She didn't open just a curiosity shop. She built an institution. Edith professionalized the operation through rigorous staff training, and her team became the key builders of what now is the Maine Museums Association. By the time she passed away in 1969, Edith had purchased 4 additional buildings to create our museum campus as it sits today. She established one of the earliest Maine craft associations, hired curators from the Met in New York City, and I believe mastered the art of twisting the arm of anyone who had a historic artifact or piece of art, convincing them to donate it to the public domain at the museum rather than keeping it hidden away in the closet. She was only one of only 21 single women in the United States who used her independent wealth, not a husband's money, to found a museum, which I find pretty great. And there she is as a young person on Kennebunk Beach. It's a strange thing to look back at the grand canvas of history and realize that you would not have been included if you existed at the time. But that feeling of loss that I used to feel while watching those old war movies, which I still love on the couch, has been replaced with a different perspective. History is a collaborative ecosystem. While technically there's still no band of sisters, Edith Barry and the millions of memory keepers across American history found a workaround. If they couldn't be part of the mainstream narrative, they built the archives to house them. They built accessible public spaces where history of both town and country could live so that today we can all stand together, share our stories, and remember who we are.
Thank you, Cynthia. Let me pause here to note that on July 4th, there will be 2 public readings of the Declaration of Independence. The first at 10 a.m., sponsored by the Kennebunkport Historical Society at Townhouse Corners, and the second, sponsored by the Kennebunk Rotary Club and the Brickstore Museum, will be at noon at the Kennebunk Town Hall, and will also feature a special reading of the Gettysburg Address by one of our speakers this evening, Joe Foster. I will let our next speaker, Bill Grabin, describe more fully the Just History Project that he and others initiated to highlight people that have lived here on these lands among us and before us, who have been historically marginalized, including Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. Hours of volunteer research have uncovered the stories of several hundred people, and Bill has agreed to share one of those remarkable tales with us this evening.
Thank you, Tom. Pleasure to be here tonight. The Just History Project. It's a database that has been created on the Brickstore Museum website. It was launched last year. There are now approximately 300 entries of different individuals. We're going to learn about one of them tonight, but we certainly invite you to come to take a look at it at your convenience. It covers the towns of Wells, Kennebunk, Kennebunkport, and Arundel. I'm going to give you a little background first on this story, and then end with what I think is a remarkable little anecdote. The story is we're talking about the life of Lucy Nicolar Poolaw. She was, but before we get to her, a little background. As we're all well aware, the indigenous people were first here on this continent long before European settlers. The arrival of Europeans decimated the indigenous populations, but small fractions survived here, more in northern Maine. But then over time, connections were established again between northern Maine and southern Maine, or eastern and western. For a period of almost 60 years, from 1878 to 1936, several families of Penobscot and Passamaquoddy came down each summer from Indian Island, which is in the Penobscot River, just above Old Town. They traveled down and spent the summer here in what was known as an Indian village or encampment. It was along the lower Kennebunk River, roughly where Port Lobster and Mabel's restaurant are today. They constructed and sold birch bark canoes and woven baskets, and they were part of the community here for almost 6 decades. This was an ad, I don't have a date on it, but early 20th century. Joe Rankos were one of the families that joined the encampment every summer. Expert guide and canoe builder, canoes built to order for sale or let. Manufactory and wharf at Cape Arundel near Indian encampment. And that was a big thing. And this again, this encampment lasted until 1936, when it was finally removed. It had really declined at that point due to the Depression and lack of people to sell canoes to. So it was the end of an era. Now, among these families, and among the people in the family, was one most remarkable young woman. Lucy Nicolar was born in 1882 on Indian Island, and she would come down to Kennebunkport, which was then Kennebunkport, 2 words, each summer. Officially, the name was changed officially, if I have this correct, to 1 word, Kennebunkport, in 1955. Among many other talents, she was a noted vocalist. She signed a contract with the Victor Talking Machine Company, the forerunner of RCA Victor, and she performed both locally and across the country using the stage name of Princess Wadawaso, and this was a typical costume that she would perform in. But beyond being a performer and vocalist, she was a fierce advocate for the rights of her people. Along with her sister Florence, she worked to improve the life of their people. The sisters raised the educational standards of their community by gaining access for Penobscot children to public education. In 1950, they persuaded the state to build a bridge to Indian Island. There had not been one previously. It had just been accessible by ferry or canoe, which certainly would be difficult in the winter or bad weather, and that was a huge step forward for them to have that bridge to the mainland. But most of all, they were fanatic advocates for suffrage. In 1924, the U.S. government passed the Indian Citizenship Act, granting citizenship to all indigenous people. But as we're well aware today, the details were left to the states, and the states retained jurisdiction within their borders. Maine used its 1820 Constitution to deny suffrage to those living on reservations. And it wasn't until 1954, 30 years later, that Maine voters passed a ballot referendum permitting Native Americans to vote. And the following year, Lucy's work was honored as she was selected to be the first indigenous person residing on a reservation in Maine to cast a legal vote in a federal election. Yet, due to legislative error, and I really only learned the full story of this afternoon when I was doing a little checking some details, full suffrage wasn't achieved until 1967. At that time, there was a bit of a revelation. This is a story from the Portland Press Herald revealing that even though they were granted suffrage in 1954, the steps were never taken to enable them to vote for state representative. And this was not common knowledge whatsoever. So the Press Herald ran this story. The legislature sprung into action and drafted some legislation that was passed, and Governor Curtis signed it, that enabled them to be represented in the state legislature. So another 13 years passed before that was, before their suffrage was fully realized. Now all this is background and prelude to one remarkable little episode that I want to share. In January of 1900, Lucy, then 17 years old, somehow heard that a debate was going to be held in New York City on the topic of immigration and whether it was a danger to true Americans. She elected to travel by herself at 17 years old from Indian Island to New York City to attend the debate and potentially share her thoughts. According to contemporary accounts, the debaters concluded that immigration was dangerous and threatening to all true Americans. Lucy rose to speak. That's not what she said. Lucy rose to speak. I believe I am the only true American here. I think you have decided rightly that immigration is dangerous to all true Americans. Of all my forefathers' country, from the St. John to the Connecticut, we now have but a little island, but a half-mile square. There are only 500 of us now. We are very happy on our island, but we are poor. The railroad corporations, which did their share of robbing us of our land, are now even begrudging us half-rate fare. But we forgive you all. The room fell silent. Then the president of the society announced that there would not be a musical feature, as the pianist who had been scheduled was ill, unless someone volunteered. Lucy walked to the piano and played several selections from Chopin. She then sang a plaintive song that, according to a journalist, touched everyone in the room. And clearly she was a remarkable young woman and a remarkable woman, throughout her life. She did so much for her people and for all of us, really, all the people of Maine. We owe her a great debt, and she was part of this community for a couple of decades. And she did concerts here. She performed at Picnic Rock, among many other places. So, thank you.
As Bill noted, I know he would welcome your interest and support of this project, so please approach him and any of the other speakers this evening at the conclusion of the program to learn more about their respective work and institutions. I'm sure I'm not the only one in this room who was taught high school English by our next speaker, Joe Foster. Towards the end of his legendary career, Mr. Foster, as we all knew him then, discovered the power of bringing World War II veterans to his classroom to engage with his students and share their life stories. As part of his fascination with that war and that era, he also undertook his own research and will now share with us the fruits of those efforts.
Thank you. I'm probably the only person in the room who remembers him weighing 68 pounds. It's interesting, you know, having been around a while, every once in a while I'm invited to class reunions and that sort of thing. It's a bit of a shock to find yourself chatting with former students who are now on Medicare. Now, I don't know, I don't want to confuse you as I try to tell the story about 4 boys who graduated from Kennebunkport High School 86 years ago, and how that relates to the 250th anniversary that we've been talking about, to World War II, to abstract terms such as valor and patriotism, service and sacrifice, and how they all relate to our hopes for the future of the United States of America. That's all in 10 minutes. The opening of Kennebunkport High Schools in the fall of '39 had been postponed by 2 weeks to allow the finishing touches added and to get it ready for the gleaming state-of-the-art brand new school building. Everyone in town, and certainly the students in grades 7 through 12 were excited to move finally from the crowded old school on Park Street, which was where the high school was, to the showplace on Fletcher Street. For more than 2 years, there had been much discussion. By the way, I'm just interrupting myself here to remember, until 1947 or 8, Kennebunkport had its own high school. Some of you may not be aware of that. So Kennebunkers were alone at that event in the 39. For more than 2 years, there had been much discussion, beginning in late 1936, about whether a new school was warranted at all. Some of those meetings, when you read the York County Star of the period, were pretty heated. Doesn't change much, does it? Debate and finally a vote in April of 38 settled the issue by deciding to build a new 6-year grammar school and high school under construction. It would close at least 4 one-room schools around the area, as well as other schools on Grove Street, Lower Village, and West Kennebunk, as they all would be consolidated to a school on, well, what had been the high school on Park Street, and then the other at Cousins School. All of those were brought together. The new school, those of you who remember 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 years ago when the new school was built and the price, the school then was $127,186, which was partially offset by a federal government allocation of $77,600 of WPA funds. Now, some of you may know what WPA was. It was FDR's New Deal stimulus project that helped national infrastructure be replaced, schools, dams, post offices. You ever wonder why a lot of post offices look like other post offices you've seen? Bridges, and many other national infrastructure of schools and all that sort of thing. And it put many, many people back to work who had been hobbled by the Depression. So on September 25th, 1939, Kennebunk High School was open for business. The Kennebunk Star headlined its colonial design as the most beautiful building ever erected in the town of Kennebunk. And it did look pretty darn good. The senior class, destined for graduation in June 1940, would be the first to graduate from school. It's doubtful that another occurrence earlier that same month had garnered much attention in what was then a pretty provincial small town, still locked in the throes of the national economic crisis. Other than the Boston and Maine Railroad, Route 1 leading in and out of town was the only link to the outside world. And US 1 was pretty much a country road then. The Maine Turnpike was 8 years away. Between the intersection of Fletcher and Storer Streets and Alewife and West Kennebunk were many open fields. Still, if folks paid much attention to the world's news that autumn, they might indeed have heard on the radio that Adolf Hitler's army had invaded Poland. That's supposed to be a secret. They had invaded Poland on September 1st, 24 days before school opened. But without a doubt, events in faraway Europe registered little on most depression-weary Kennebunk residents, and certainly not to those excited teenagers at the sparkling new Kennebunk High School. For the entering senior class, however, the events of September 1st, 1939, would have far-reaching and fatal consequences before the next 5 years passed. In that class, there were 4 particular members that is the focus of this remembrance. They called themselves the 4 Musketeers. They were great friends, in school and out, and were usually seen in pairs or as a quartet around town when they were not working or at a sports practice. 3 of the 4 were outstanding athletes whose records stand to this day. As they and their classmates that September of '39 were enjoying the end of a golden era of peace and innocence, what lay ahead in the next 4 years would change them all forever. Roby Wentworth, John Babine, Andrew Murphy, and Pitt Warren, all typical Maine teenagers, were poised on the edge of adulthood that fall. Since their freshman year in 1936, Roby, Pitt, and Johnny had dominated Kennebunk High School athletics. Over the next 4 years, from 36 on, the football team would garner 27 wins and 1 loss and 1 tie. In 1937, they scored 233 points against no points for 8 opponents. Their only loss in 4 years was in their senior year, the fall of '39, when they lost to much larger Deering High School. And that Deering now is much closer in size to the current Kennebunk High School, but then there was a big difference. Johnny Babine was a standout on the gridiron, scoring touchdowns in games played, in all games he played. Against Biddeford in '38, he had touchdown runs of 78 and 84 yards. Beginning his sophomore year, Roby Wentworth started every game as left end, playing both offense and defense, and usually playing the entire game. Indeed, one sports writer described Roby as one of the state's best linemen. In 1939, sports banquet held at the Kennebunk Inn, and special certificates were handed out to 4 boys who had played all 4 years: Bob Chase, Babine, Warren, and Wentworth. In basketball, it was much the same story. In the 36-37 season, Kennebunk won 17 games and lost 1, beating out York for the Southern York County League Championship. Babine, Warren, and Wentworth continued to add spark to winning teams throughout the next 3 years, usually with Pitt and Johnny the high scorers of every game. In '38, their record was 25-3, '39, 18-3, and in 1940, 16-6. In baseball, it was much the same again. In 1939, KHS lost to Berwick for a league title. In 1940, they lost to Trape Academy. Warren, Babine, and Wentworth were once more the key players. Johnny Babine was a state champion track star, and his medals are still on display in the high school gym lobby. So, by the time they graduated in 1940, the Musketeers, like all 18-year-olds, started to look to the future. Pitt found work locally for a while, continuing to court Aileen Page, who would graduate the following year. They would marry in 1943, wasting no time. And by that time, he had joined the Army, eventually becoming a staff sergeant in the Army Air Corps. Andy Murphy, the short, red-headed, fast-talking lad of Irish heritage, was the only one of the Musketeers to head off to college immediately. And like his 3 friends, he'd found other pursuits than sports, and his grades and his father's business as the local Hudson dealer. How many of you know what a Hudson was? The business was located, the dealership, where Jim's Service Center is now, and allowed him to the boy to go off to college in the fall of 1940. He was a much-loved only child of doting parents. But by 1944, he had left college and was a lieutenant in the Army Air Corps. He trained as a navigator on B-24 bombers. Johnny, the KHS All-Star, tried a number of things following graduation, including a scholarship to Kent's Hill School for his sports ability. In the fall of 1940, he was driven back to school, or driven to school, by Pitt and Andy and Andy's Hudson. On the way back, Pitt and Hudson boy decided to visit a girl they knew in Booth Bay. So it took 2 days for them to get back here. And it's questionable, we won't get into that. And as they drove into Kennebunk, they saw near the bridge downtown Johnny. He beat them home. School was not for him. As his teacher, some of you may remember Ola McGuire, who taught for 50 years in Kennebunk. And I interviewed her some years ago. She said she always whispered when she talked about students as if somebody would hear. And she would say, "Oh, he was a wonderful boy, but he wasn't a student." He found several jobs locally, including at Kessel and Shoe over the coming months, but eventually joined the Army after Pearl Harbor. Roby, whose parents had owned the Wentworth Hotel on Sea Road, and who was the uncle of the young woman who was putting up the slides and related in some way or other by marriage to Mr. Putnam. Times, I shouldn't have interrupted myself. Robbie owned the hotel on, how many of you remember seeing that? Are you old enough? It would be where Seafields is now on the lower end of the road. And there were 12 children. Times were tough in those days. The summer was when any money was going to be made for hotels locally. And being in the 1930s, still in the throes of the Depression, it was not a good time when tourists had a lot of inclination to spend money and heaven knows what on vacation. So the 30s were not good for the tourist industry here then. The boys in the Wentworth family all worked at the hotel as well as other jobs to keep the family going. Roby had been accepted into Springfield College in the fall of 1940, but his father's recent serious illness had left the family with massive medical bills. Now, the Depression and the war in Europe, as well as the fact that the Canadians were prohibited from spending money outside of their country once they went to war, it all had a disastrous effect on the hotel business, and you can imagine. There was no money for him to go to college that fall. He worked at a filling station in the port, and there was one here once, or two even. And later spent a year working at the shipyard in South Portland, which was turning out much needed Liberty ships that were being used to carry goods to save England in convoys. He worked there until the fall of 1942 when he joined the Merchant Marine. It was in the Merchant Marine that Roby finally got the chance to begin the education that he felt would lead him to a secure job once the war was over. He spent 6 months training as an officer at the United States Merchant Marine Academy in Kings Point, New York, graduating in June of 1944. That month, though he could not be present in person, he had purchased an engagement ring for his sweetheart, Ermina Bowden, back in Kennebunk. On July 6, he managed to get to Kennebunk to see his gal in person, returning to New York the next day. He spent 1 day with her. On August 19th, he sailed from New York on the SS Jacksonville, a tanker carrying airplane fuel. Lieutenant Andrew Murphy was the first of the musketeers to die. As a navigator, as I mentioned, on a B-24 Liberator bound for North Africa, Lieutenant Murphy and his crew flew from Harrington Army Air Force Base in Kansas, where they had undergone training. They were bound for Natal, Brazil, the jumping off place for the flight over the Atlantic. probably headed for North Africa. The plane disappeared in that April 1943 flight, and nothing was ever heard of it or its crew again. When word arrived back in Kennebunk, Andrew's parents were devastated. Only child and pride of their life, this fun-loving redhead had given his all for his country, and the light had gone out of their lives. Andy Murphy was 21 years old. Pitt Warren, on July 10th, 1944, was a tail gunner on a B-24 named Two Pops. The name painted on the fuselage was in honor of two crew members who were about to become fathers. The Liberator was on a bombing mission over Munich, Germany, when it was hit by flak and badly damaged. The pilot turned to head towards Switzerland, hoping to set the plane down in neutral territory, which Switzerland was during the war. The pilot turned towards Switzerland, but German fighters intercepted them, the crippled plane, and headed them toward Italy. They landed and were taken prisoner in Verona, were endlessly interrogated, poorly fed, and marched all the time. Eventually, they were loaded into boxcars and taken to Stalag No. 4 in the Baltic. They remained there until the end of the war. Pitt was liberated in May of 1945. He weighed 160 pounds when he left home and weighed 120 pounds when he came back. Aileen lived in the house they built on High Street in Kennebunk until her death about 3 years ago at the age of 99. And it was from her that I got a lot of this story. Pitt died in 1986. Less than a week after Pitt's plane was shot down, on July 18, 1944, as the American Army fought its way toward Germany, Private John Babine was killed in France. Following D-Day on June 6, the Allies had fought long and hard as it pushed the Nazis back toward Germany. The movie Saving Private Ryan and the TV series Band of Brothers well depict the kind of fighting and the kind of action that John Babine faced. He received both the Silver Star for Valor and a Purple Heart posthumously, and those medals are on display in the current Kennebunk High School lobby. Should you be going through there sometime, stop and take a look. Third Officer Robbie Wentworth's first mission on the tanker SS Jacksonville, filled with 80-octane gasoline, was to take him to Loch Ewe, Scotland. It had crossed the Atlantic as part of a 32-ship convoy, the bulk of which was headed for Liverpool, England, but the tankers were diverted to Scotland. Of those, 4 of them proceeded in single file to Loch Ewe. On August 30th, 1944, the Jacksonville was hit amidships by a torpedo fired from U-482. Fire broke out immediately, and the ship became engulfed, stem to stern. Then a second torpedo broke the ship in two, and she sank. 80 men were aboard. 2 survived. Roby Wentworth was no doubt on duty in the engine room. He was 23 years old. So that's the story of the class of 1940. Besides the 4 musketeers out of a class of 40 people, others served their country before the war was over. 14 of them, of the class of 1940, in addition to those 4 boys. So that would be half the class served. And it was going to be that way for the next 4 years until 1945. They all started out in that spanking new school that long ago, September 25th, and knew little what lay ahead of them, nor how their lives would change forever because of events of those first 3 weeks of September 1939. So as we celebrate 250 years of independence, we should indeed recall all those servicemen over the decades, starting in Concord in 1775, men and women who gave their last full measure of devotion when called upon by their country to fight on far-off shores. Many or some of those wars were vital to the establishment of the lasting success of our democracy and the life we lead today. Some wars do not necessarily have a positive effect or a reason for being, but our young men and women have always been at the ready over the last 250 years. Patriotism, service, valor, sacrifice. Like the four musketeers, all were in the full flower of youth and potential, even down to a few young people a month or two ago in Iran. To paraphrase John Maxwell Edmonds, for our today, they gave their tomorrow. So we owe them our everlasting gratitude as a country and as a free democracy. Thank you very much.
One other announcement of a coming event. The Brickstore Museum will be having a special viewing of Maine Historical Society's original broadside of the Declaration of Independence from July 30th to August 1st, and you are welcome to visit during that time and to view that historic document. My talk is slightly different, shifting from town to country, and less focused on the life stories of two individuals I admire, John F. Kennedy and E.B. White, and more on how their words, though dated, resonate in our time. For those of you who don't know me, I grew up in town, and I spent the majority of my career working at the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library in Boston. Many stories of JFK's life remain with me, but one that is apropos to the 250th anniversary celebrations is that after his election in November of 1960, he flew in a small private plane from Boston down to his parents' home in West Palm Beach, Florida, to prepare for his administration and to write his historic inaugural address. And he recalled later that on that flight down the eastern seaboard and over many of those original 13 colonies, he looked upon the land he was about to lead, and he wondered what could he say to reignite the revolutionary spirit of the American people. The speech, of course, was given at the height of the Cold War, having once been allies with the Soviet Union during World War II, and later finding ourselves in a worldwide competition between capitalist democracies and totalitarian communist rule. Now, you likely recall many of the famous phrases from JFK's speech, but perhaps not these words at its opening, in which JFK reminded his fellow citizens that at that unique moment in history, quote, "The same revolutionary beliefs for which our forebears fought are still at issue around the globe. The belief that the rights of man come not from the generosity of the state, but from the hand of God. We dare not forget," he continued, "that we are the heirs of that first revolution, proud of our ancient heritage, and unwilling to witness or permit the slow undoing of those human rights to which this nation has always been committed, and to which we are committed today at home and around the world." Close quote. Now, the inauguration happened on a cold winter's day in Washington, D.C. There'd been a snowstorm the night before. President Eisenhower, Vice President Nixon, Vice President Johnson, and their wives all wore winter coats, but JFK did not, wishing to portray a sense of youth, a sense of strength, and in his Boston accent, a sense of vigor. 2.5 years later, In the wake of his tragic assassination, many offered eulogies. The one I most like to quote was written by E.B. White, who offered this brief tribute. When we think of him, he is without a hat, standing in the wind and weather. He was impatient of topcoats and hats, preferring to be exposed, and he was young enough and tough enough to enjoy the cold and the wind of those times. It can be said of him, as of few men in a like position, that he did not fear the weather and did not trim his sails, but instead challenged the wind itself to improve its direction and to cause it to blow more softly and more kindly over the world and its people. Close quote. Though E.B. White was born outside of New York City, he moved to Maine in 1938, where he lived with his family in an 18th century farmhouse in North Brooklyn, overlooking Allen's Cove and Blue Hill Harbor, a town and a setting very much like Cape Porpoise. What happens to me when I cross the Piscataqua and plunge rapidly into Maine at a cost of 75 cents in tolls? He once wrote, I cannot describe it. I do not ordinarily spy a partridge in a pear tree or 3 French hens, but I do have the sensation of having received a gift from a true love. And in a small boathouse on the edge of his property, about the same size as the Rose Cabin, shown here in this photo, he not only penned iconic stories for children, but essays for adults. I often return to White's words, which, though dated to their era, contain certain elements of timeless wisdom and are infused by the sensibilities of a coastal Maine village. The first one I'd like to share with you was written during World War II and was published in the July 3rd, 1943 edition of the New Yorker magazine. Quote, we received a letter from the Writers' War Board the other day, White wrote, asking for a statement on the meaning of democracy. It presumably is our duty to comply with such a request, and it is certainly our pleasure. Surely the board knows what democracy is. It's the line that forms at the right. It's the don't and don't shove. Democracy is the recurrent suspicion that more than half of the people are right more than half of the time. It's the feeling of privacy in the voting booths, the feeling of communion in the libraries, the feeling of vitality everywhere. Democracy is a letter to the editor. It's an idea which hasn't been disproved yet, a song the words of which have not gone bad. It's the mustard on the hot dog and the cream in the ration coffee. Democracy is a request from a war board in the middle of the morning, in the middle of a war, wanting to know what democracy is. Close quote. The second anecdote comes from a well-known piece E.B. White wrote some 30 years later in 1973. He had received a note in the mail from a Mr. Netto, in which the letter writer expressed his concern for humanity during the nuclear arms race. In his reply, Mr. White references the grandfather clock in his saltwater farmhouse, which reminds me of the dumbwaiter in the back of this room, a piece of Yankee ingenuity which has worked now for over a century, its ropes and pulleys still in good order. Dear Mr. Netto, White's response begins. As long as there is one upright man, as long as there is one compassionate woman, the contagion may spread and the scene is not desolate. Hope is the thing that is left to us in a bad time. I shall get up Sunday morning and wind the clock as a contribution to order and steadfastness. Sailors have an expression about the weather. They say the weather is a great bluffer. And I guess the same is true of our human society. Things can look dark, then a break shows in the cloud and all has changed, sometimes rather suddenly. It is quite obvious that the human race has made a queer mess of life on this planet. But as a people, we probably harbor seeds of goodness that have lain for a long time, waiting to sprout when the conditions are right. Man's curiosity, his relentlessness, his inventiveness, his ingenuity have led him into deep trouble. We can only hope these same traits will enable him to claw himself out. Hang on to your hat, hang on to your hope, and wind the clock, for tomorrow is another day. Towards the end of his life, E.B. White avoided public gatherings like this one. He once got to the threshold of the local congregational church for the funeral of a close friend, but couldn't manage to make it inside. His stepson, Roger Angell, noted that White, who he and others called Andy, even skipped the private burial of White's wife, Catherine, in the Brooklyn Cemetery in July of 1977. None of us in the family expected otherwise or held it against him, Roger Angell remarked. And when the time came, 8 years later, for E.B. White's own memorial service, Mr. Angell quipped at that time, "If Andy White could be with us today, he would not be here with us today." But White's spirit and his commitments live on through his words and example, as do those of James Burnham, Lucy Nicolar Poolaw, Roby Wentworth, John Babine, Andrew Murphy, Pitt Warren, John F. Kennedy, Edith Barry, and of course, in the immortal phrases crafted and edited by Jefferson, Adams, Franklin, and others 250 years ago this very week. We are indeed heirs to that first revolution. As we sit tonight in this historic building, adjacent to the harbor where a Revolutionary War battle occurred, let me propose a couple additions to E.B. White's classic definition. Democracy is the overabundance of desserts when the call goes out that we need more food for the reception. It can be found in community gatherings such as this one, which help to reignite our revolutionary spirit, remind us of the daily tasks we might undertake as contributions to order and steadfastness, and encourage us not to fear the weather or to trim our sails. And in that spirit, we thank you all for coming, and in turn thank our four speakers whose stories offered us moments of history, humor, and hope, sturdy pegs on which we might hang our hats and face another day. So one last announcement. I hope you'll all consider joining us exactly a month from now on August 1st for an event we are calling Postcards from Cape Porpoise, a festive wine and cheese gathering to celebrate local artists at which we can reconnect once again. And attendees can purchase beautiful original pieces of artwork with the proceeds being divided by local artists and Atlantic Hall. There are flyers in the back of the room if you'd like to learn more. And soon you'll see lawn signs like these as part of our not-so-subliminal messaging. And now I welcome you to join us in a festive reception at the back of the hall. Let me just explain, we're not going to remove all of the chairs, but a few of us are going to remove, and you can help if you like, the back 5 rows just to give area to mill around. So there are plenty of desserts, as I mentioned, crackers and cheese, wine and beer. We thank you all for coming, and we wish everyone a safe and meaningful 4th of July. We did it. Tom Bradbury has some artifacts from the battle if you would like to see some musket shots and cannonball.